Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager, your favourite way to fall asleep while accidentally learning something ridiculous. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into the world of American men in the 1920s, and not the boring history book version, not the men in suits signing documents and looking important. I mean the other men, the men who spent their weekends doing absolutely unhinged things because apparently just sitting still was considered a moral failure. So before we go any further, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you actually enjoy what we do here. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from, and whether you're the kind of person who has ever voluntarily done something uncomfortable for fun, because tonight is going to make you feel very sane by comparison. Dim those lights, turn on a fan, maybe crack a window, get horizontal, get comfortable, and let yourself sink into that mattress like you've earned it. Because you have. Now, let's pause for a moment and really think about this. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to be an American man in the 1920s? Did they wake up every morning just absolutely vibrating with the need to do something dangerous? Was the mustache a requirement, or just strongly encouraged? Did they ever look at a perfectly calm lake and think, you know what? I should jump off something into that? What was it about that era that made a man look at a live bear, a 1,000-foot cliff, a roaring automobile engine, or a complete stranger and think, I could probably take that? Why were they racing things that had no business being raced? Why were they eating things that had no business being eaten? And did any of them even once pause and say, wait, maybe I should just stay home? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1923. You have a flat cap, a vague sense of superiority, and absolutely zero concept of personal risk. The decade is roaring, the economy is booming, and someone somewhere has just dared you to do something spectacular. Good luck, pal. Let's talk about cars. Or more specifically, about what happens when men who have never gone faster than a horse decide that 30 miles per hour is just not enough. The automobile arrived in America at the beginning of the 20th century and immediately became the most dangerous toy anyone had ever been handed. By the 1920s, men across the country had developed a relationship with their vehicles that can only be described as deeply personal and deeply irrational. They were not driving their cars to get somewhere. They were driving their cars to see how fast they could possibly go before something went wrong. And then when something went wrong, they were extremely interested in figuring out how to go even faster next time. You're a man of the 1920s. You have a car. You may have bought it second-hand. You may have built parts of it yourself, but the point is, it exists, it runs. And at some point this week you're going to find an empty stretch of road and see what it does. The car is loud, it smells like oil and burning rubber and ambition. The steering wheel is large, the brakes are modest, and the seat offers roughly the same cushioning as a wooden church pew. None of this concerns you. You're not here for comfort. You are here for speed. Organised automobile racing had been happening in America since the late 1800s. But in the 20s it became something different, something larger, more formal, and considerably more deadly. The Indianapolis 500, which had begun in 1911, was by the 1920s one of the most watched sporting events in the country. Hundreds of thousands of spectators gathered at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway each May to watch drivers in open cockpit cars hurl themselves around an oval track at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour, wearing leather helmets, goggles, and a light linen driving suit that would have offered meaningful protection against approximately nothing. But Indianapolis was the professional end. What happened at the local level was something else entirely. Across America, men organized informal races on dirt roads, on beach stretches, on any flat surface long enough to build some speed before you had to stop or turn. Daytona Beach in Florida became a famous proving ground where drivers would run their cars along the hard-packed sand with the Atlantic Ocean on one side and a crowd of spectators on the other. The rules were minimal. The preparation was whatever you had time for the night before. The results were a mixture of the thrilling and the catastrophic. And somehow both outcomes seemed to encourage more people to enter. The cars themselves were a significant part of the appeal. Manufacturers like Duesenberg, Packard, and later Ford were producing machines that went faster every year, and the culture around them was intensely masculine and intensely competitive. Men discussed engine specifications the way other men discussed baseball statistics. They modified their vehicles, adjusted their carburetors, changed their tyre pressures, and debated endlessly about the ideal weight distribution for high-speed cornering. This was, you understand, a decade in which cars regularly caught fire, lost wheels, and flew off roads into ditches. And yet the primary concern of most racing enthusiasts was whether they could shave 4 seconds off their lap time. There was also the matter of the clothes. The racing driver of the 1920s cut a specific figure: leather helmet pulled low, goggles up, a scarf sometimes wrapped around the lower face against the dust, gauntlet gloves on the hands. You looked serious. You looked capable. You looked like a man who had made peace with the possibility of mechanical failure at 90 miles per hour, and who had decided that peace was frankly a fair trade for going this fast. The Indianapolis 500 of 1923 was won by Tommy Milton at an average speed of 90 miles per hour. The crowd roared. The newspapers celebrated. And somewhere on a back road in Ohio, a man in a Model T pressed his foot down a little harder just to see. Let's talk about flagpole sitting, which is exactly what it sounds like, and somehow worse. In the summer of 1924, a man by the name of Alvin Shipwreck Kelly climbed to the top of a flagpole in Hollywood, California, sat down on a small platform attached to it, and proceeded to stay there for 13 hours and 13 minutes. The crowd loved it. The newspapers loved it. And something in the American male brain that had previously lain dormant lit up like a firework. Within months, men across the country were climbing flagpoles and refusing to come down, as if gravity were optional and common sense had taken the decade off. You're standing at the base of a flagpole. It is approximately 75 feet tall. At the top, there is a small disc-shaped platform roughly the size of a dinner plate, on which you are expected to sit for as long as humanly possible. You look up. The platform looks very small. The ground looks very comfortable. You begin climbing anyway, because you told the newspaper you were going to do this. And the newspaper has already sent a photographer. Shipwreck Kelly was the undisputed king of the discipline. Born Alvin Anthony Kelly in New York City, he was a former sailor and occasional boxer who had developed a talent for drawing a crowd and an apparent immunity to the sensation of his legs falling asleep. He refined his flagpole technique over years of practice, developing a method that involved locking his thumbs into holes drilled in the pole to keep himself from falling off during the short catnaps he permitted himself, each one no longer than a few minutes, balanced on a platform designed to make extended sleep a structural impossibility. At the height of the flagpole-sitting craze, Kelly was booked by hotels, department stores, and promotional events across the country. His appearances were advertised in advance. Crowds of hundreds, sometimes thousands, would gather below and simply look up at him. He would wave occasionally. He would eat food sent up to him in buckets. He would, if the crowd was lucky, shift position slightly. This was the entertainment. People watched a man sit on a pole, and they loved it, and nobody seems to have questioned whether this said something concerning about the pace of 1920s leisure. The records escalated rapidly once Kelly proved the thing was possible. By 1930, he had sat on flagpoles for a total of more than 20,000 hours across his career. His personal best single sitting stretched to 49 days, which he completed in Atlantic City in 1930, by which point he had presumably made his peace with wind, rain, boredom, and the specific existential experience of watching the world go about its business from a height at which it all looks equally small and pointless. The copycats were everywhere. Young men across America climbed radio towers, building cornices, and anything else with sufficient height and a surface wide enough to sit on. Cities began passing ordinances against it. Hotels began hiring flagpole sitters as promotional stunts. One department store in Baltimore offered a cash prize to any man who could outlast their in-house record holder, and reportedly received 47 applications in a single week. What you notice sitting up there in the wind with your legs dangling and a small crowd of people eating hot dogs below you is that the experience is simultaneously terrible and oddly peaceful. The city noise fades to a kind of low ambient hum. The breeze is constant. The view, admittedly, is good. You have nothing to do and nowhere to be, and no one can reach you, which in 1924 is about as close to freedom as a man could reasonably get. Shipwreck Kelly eventually outlived the craze, continued performing, and died in 1952, reportedly found collapsed on a New York City street, carrying newspaper clippings of all his greatest flagpole achievements in his pocket. He had spent more time on top of poles than most people spend on vacation, and he seemed by all accounts to have considered this a life well lived. Let's talk about dance marathons, which started as entertainment and ended somewhere in the neighbourhood of a medical emergency. By the early 1920s, dance halls across America were hosting competitive endurance dancing events. Contests where couples would take to the floor and simply keep dancing, for hours, then days, then sometimes weeks, to see who could outlast everyone else. The prize was usually a modest cash sum. The cost was everything else. You would shuffle around a floor in a half-conscious state, leaning on your partner like a human crutch, eating soup from a spoon that someone was holding for you because your arms had largely stopped cooperating, and you would do this willingly. You and your partner have been on this floor for 31 hours. Your feet stopped hurting somewhere around hour 12, and have now entered a phase that the medical profession would describe as numbness, and that you are choosing to describe as fine. The band has been playing since yesterday. The band does not look well either. The ballroom is large, the lighting is dim, and scattered across the floor are perhaps 40 other couples in various states of consciousness, some dancing, some shuffling, some essentially just leaning against each other in a slow, rotating way that technically qualifies as movement. Dance marathons operated under a fairly simple set of rules. Couples had to keep moving. There was usually a rule that you could not both have your knees off the floor at the same time, meaning sleep was limited to whatever you could manage while your partner held you upright and shuffled slowly in a circle. Judges patrolled the floor. Rest breaks were brief, typically 10 or 15 minutes per hour, during which contestants could sit, eat, receive foot massages from corner attendants, and stare into the middle distance with the hollow expression of people who have begun questioning their fundamental choices. The spectators paid to watch, and they came in significant numbers, which tells you something useful about the 1920s. This was live entertainment, and it was compelling in the specific way that human endurance always is. The crowd wanted to see how long people could last, and also wanted the vicarious thrill of watching someone push past every reasonable limit. MCs kept the energy up between moments of genuine drama. When a couple finally collapsed or was disqualified, it was treated as a significant event. There was applause. There were sometimes boos. The physical toll was substantial. Competitors lost weight at visible rates. Blisters developed and burst and developed again. Ankles swelled. Backs gave out. In severe cases, contestants developed what was described at the time as marathon feet, a condition involving significant swelling, nerve damage, and a weeks-long recovery. Doctors were often stationed at the events. This was not a deterrent. It was essentially an acknowledgement. What drove men and their partners to compete in these things was a combination of factors that the 20s made very specific. For some, it was money. During the depression that followed, dance marathons became a genuine economic lifeline for people who needed the prize money or the free meals that came with being a competitor. But in the early 20s, before the crash, it was more about spectacle, about being seen, about the particular glamour of lasting longer than everyone else, of being the couple still on their feet when the floor had claimed everyone around you. Hour 31 becomes hour 32. Your partner is asleep on your shoulder. You're technically asleep too, in a philosophical sense, though your feet are still moving. The band plays on. You're not winning anything except the specific pride of a man who decided he was not going to stop, and has so far been correct about that. It is not comfortable. It is, in its strange, shuffling way, exactly what you came here for. Let's talk about barnstorming, which is one of those words that sounds exciting until you realise it involves an early airplane, a farmer's field, and absolutely no safety regulations whatsoever. After the First World War ended, thousands of military pilots came home with flying skills, surplus aircraft, and a complete inability to do anything that wasn't at least mildly life-threatening. Their solution was to fly their planes from town to town across rural America, land in a convenient field, and then charge the local population a few dollars each to ride along, or, if you were the genuinely unhinged type, to perform tricks on the wings while the plane was in the air. You have landed your Curtiss Jenny in a field outside of a small town in Indiana. The Jenny, the JN-4 training biplane that the military sold off as surplus after the war for as little as $200 a piece, is a reliable machine, generally speaking, though the definition of reliable in 1922 involves a somewhat wider margin of acceptable outcomes than it would today. You have a small hand-painted sign attached to the side of the aircraft that reads, "Rides $5. A crowd is already forming at the edge of the field, because a plane landing in a field in rural Indiana in 1922 is still a genuinely remarkable event, and people have walked from the surrounding farms to look at it. Barnstorming pilots became some of the most celebrated figures of the decade. They travelled circuits through the Midwest and the South and the West, landing wherever they could find a flat stretch of ground, performing for whoever showed up, and moving on before local authorities had time to form an opinion about whether any of this was legal. The performances ranged from simple joy rides, charging passengers for a short loop around the area, to full aerial shows featuring loops, rolls, dives, and the stomach-dropping combination maneuver known as the falling leaf, in which the pilot would cut the engine and let the plane spiral downward before pulling out at the last possible moment. The aerial circuses were the apex of the form. Groups of pilots would travel together, performing coordinated shows at county fairs and public events, and their competition between them drove the stunt steadily further toward the implausible. They flew under bridges, they raced automobiles, they transferred passengers between moving planes. One popular act involved picking up a handkerchief from the ground with a hook attached to the wingtip while flying low, which is either a demonstration of extraordinary skill or a sign that someone had run out of reasonable ideas and kept going anyway. The risks were not theoretical. Barnstorming was genuinely dangerous, and the accident rate was significant in a decade that had not yet developed meaningful aviation safety standards. Engines failed. Wings buckled. Pilots misjudged distances and altitudes. But the culture of the barnstorming circuit was not one that spent a great deal of time contemplating worst cases. The pilots were young, they were skilled, they had already survived a war, and they operated with the specific fearlessness of people who have decided that the quality of the experience matters more than its length. The audiences who showed up in those fields had often never seen a plane up close. For many of them, a $5 ride in a rattling biplane 300 feet above their own farmland was the most extraordinary thing they had ever done. A brief, loud, wind-blasted glimpse of a world that was changing faster than anyone could entirely process. They climbed back out of the cockpit with their hair destroyed, their knuckles white, and expressions of absolute radiant joy on their faces. By the mid-20s, the federal government had begun attempting to regulate aviation in ways that would gradually bring the barnstorming era to a close. The Air Commerce Act of 1926 introduced licensing requirements and safety standards that made the casual, self-taught, fly-into-a-field approach significantly more complicated. But for a brief, loud, glorious stretch of the early decade, the sky above rural America belonged to a loose confederation of young men with surplus planes and nothing to lose, and they made the most of every mile of it. Let's talk about the 6-day bicycle race, a sporting event with a name that is both completely literal and deeply upsetting. Beginning in the 1800s, but hitting peak popularity in the 1920s, these events took place in large indoor arenas, Madison Square Garden being the most famous venue, and involved teams of cyclists riding around a wooden track continuously for 6 days and 6 nights. Not 6 days. 6 days and 6 nights. You would be handed a bicycle and a partner, and the two of you would take turns pedaling while the other one slept in a small cot set up in the infield, and the whole operation would go on for 144 hours while spectators watched, drank, gambled, and occasionally threw food. You are on hour 71. The wooden track is banked steeply at the corners, steeply enough that if you slow down too much, gravity becomes an opinion you no longer get to have. The arena smells of sawdust, tobacco smoke, liniment, and the specific olfactory signature of several hundred people who have been in an enclosed space for multiple days. Your legs feel like they belong to someone else, someone who made different choices, someone who is presumably now resting comfortably somewhere. Your partner is asleep in the cot. He will be awake in 4 hours to take over. In the meantime, you pedal. 6-day racing had originated in England in the 1830s as a simple test of cycling endurance, imported to America and refined into a team format in the 1890s. By the 1920s, it had evolved into something closer to a theatrical event than a pure sporting contest. Madison Square Garden could hold 20,000 spectators, and the 6-day races filled it. Not for 6 continuous days of rapt attention, but in waves, with crowds peaking in the evenings when the racing was fastest and the atmosphere was most electric, then thinning overnight when only the most dedicated fans remained to watch the riders pedal their exhausted circuits through the small hours. The event structure awarded both distance and tactical sprints. Teams accumulated laps over the full 6 days, but periodically the organisers would announce a sprint, a designated chase during which any team that lapped another team in the standings gained a significant advantage. These sprint segments produced the most dramatic racing, with riders who had been grinding along in a controlled conserve energy rhythm suddenly summoning something from reserves they had seemed not to possess, standing on pedals, driving forward with a desperation that the crowd received with tremendous noise. The riders became celebrities. Names like Franco Giorgetti, Bobby Waldhauer Jr., and the Italian-American pairing of Reggie McNamara and his various partners were known to the sporting public the way baseball players were known, their performances tracked in the newspapers, their lap counts updated on large scoreboards visible from the upper tier of the garden. A winning team at a major 6-day event could earn several $1,000s, which was serious money in the 1920s, and which explained why men were willing to eat their meals on a bicycle, sleep in 4-hour increments for a week, and pedal somewhere in the region of 2,000 miles without ever actually going anywhere. The medical dimension was consistent with everything else about the 1920s approach to competitive sport, which is to say it was present but not allowed to be discouraging. Riders developed saddle sores. They lost significant body weight over the course of the event. Sleep deprivation caused hallucinations in the later stages. Riders reported seeing things on the track, losing track of laps, speaking to people who were not there. Team managers and trainers managed this as best they could with stimulants that were entirely legal, including strychnine in very small doses, which was a standard component of the era's athletic performance toolkit, and which is a sentence that requires a moment to sit with. You have now been on this bicycle for 3 days. Your partner is awake again. You hand off without stopping. The changeover is practiced, smooth, accomplished at speed. You find the cot. You're asleep before you have fully lain down. In 4 hours you will be back on the bicycle. In 3 more days you might win something. It seems at this particular moment like a completely reasonable way to spend a week. Let's talk about wing walking, which is the activity of climbing out of an airplane while it is flying and standing on the wing, and which was considered in the 1920s to be a perfectly reasonable way to spend a Saturday afternoon. Wing walking was the crown jewel of the barnstorming circuit, the act that made flagpole sitting look positively sensible. Men, and occasionally women, would strap themselves to the wings of low-flying biplanes and perform handstands, hang from the landing gear by their knees, transfer between 2 planes in mid-air, or simply stand there with their arms spread wide while the wind attempted to detach them from the aircraft at approximately 90 miles per hour. You are currently standing on the upper wing of a Curtiss Jenny biplane flying at 2,000 feet. The wind is approximately as violent as you would expect the wind to be when you are standing on the outside of a moving aircraft, which is to say it is spectacular and unrelenting and would very much like you to become part of the sky. Your goggles are on. Your leather helmet is buckled. One hand is gripping the center strut for reasons that the crowd below, small upturned faces, hats being held down, would prefer you release. Because the whole point of this act is that you are not holding on. Wing walking grew directly out of the barnstorming circuit, and was pioneered in the early 1920s by a loose community of performers who had identified that watching someone stand on a flying airplane was even more compelling than watching someone fly one. The first wing walkers performed relatively simple acts, climbing out of the cockpit, standing, waving, climbing back in. But the competitive pressure of the air show circuit pushed the discipline rapidly toward the extreme. Within a few years, performers were doing handstands on the top wing, hanging from the axle of the landing gear by their knees, and transferring by rope ladder between two planes flying in formation. Orma Locklear was perhaps the most famous early practitioner, a former military pilot from Texas, who began wing walking during the war as a practical matter, climbing out onto his wing to fix mechanical problems in flight, and who gradually realized that people would pay to watch him do it. He turned professional, joined a barnstorming circuit, and developed an act of such polish and daring that he was recruited by Hollywood to perform aerial stunts for the new film industry. He died in 1920 during a night filming sequence for a movie when his plane failed to pull out of a dive, a fact that did not noticeably slow down the wing-walking industry. The performers who followed Locklear operated with a mixture of genuine skill and pure theatrical instinct. They knew the crowd wanted to be frightened for them, wanted to hold their breath and then exhale loudly when the performer caught a strut or righted themselves or completed a transfer. The art was in managing that experience, giving the audience the sensation of danger while maintaining behind the performance enough actual physical control to survive the act. This was harder than it looked, and occasionally it failed, but the performers were not the sort of people who dwelt on that. The equipment involved was minimal. A leather harness attached to a strut could give a performer a safety tether, though many worked without them, on the grounds that a tether was both visible and limiting, neither of which were acceptable. Shoes with rubber soles helped with grip on the fabric-covered wing surface. Strong hands, good balance, and the specific calm of someone who had made their decision and was committed to it were considered the most essential tools. Standing on the wing at 2,000 feet, you can see for 30 miles in every direction. The aircraft hums beneath your feet with a vibration that goes through your boots and up your legs and into your chest. The crowd below is a scattering of dots. The air is cold and clear and utterly indifferent to your presence in it. You let go of the strut and spread your arms wide. The crowd screams. You are, for this exact moment, the most alive a person can probably be, while also being in a situation that has no business existing. Let's talk about rum running, because Prohibition, which kicked off in 1920, did not stop Americans from wanting alcohol. It just turned the acquisition of alcohol into a very exciting logistical challenge. Across the country, men with fast cars and a strong financial motivation began the business of transporting illegal liquor from one place to another as quickly as possible without being caught by the police. This was called rum running, and it required equal parts mechanical ingenuity, geographic knowledge, and the specific kind of calm that comes from having already decided that getting arrested was just a risk you were willing to live with. It is 2 a.m. You're driving a modified Ford Roadster down a back road in rural North Carolina, and the car is riding low on its springs because the space behind your seat and under it and beneath a false floor that took 3 weekends to build is currently occupied by approximately 40 gallons of corn whiskey. The headlights are off. You know this road. You have driven it enough times in the dark that the curves are in your body rather than your eyes. Somewhere behind you maybe is a federal agent, probably not tonight, but maybe. Prohibition created the rum-running industry almost instantly. The 18th Amendment went into effect in January of 1920, and by that spring an entire informal economy had organized itself around its violation. Alcohol moved by sea along the Atlantic coast, by truck across state lines, by small plane over the Canadian border, and by car through every network of back roads that creative geography and local knowledge could identify. The men who drove the liquor were not, for the most part, hardened criminals. They were often young men from rural communities who had discovered that their knowledge of local roads and their willingness to drive at night were suddenly worth significant money. The cars were everything. Rum runners invested heavily in their vehicles, and the modifications they developed were genuinely ingenious. Engines were upgraded for power and reliability. A breakdown on a back road with 40 gallons of illegal whiskey in the floor was a life-defining kind of bad luck, and the drivers took mechanical maintenance with intense seriousness. Suspension systems were reinforced to handle the weight of heavy cargo without revealing their sight in the way the car sat or rode. False floors and hidden compartments were built with considerable craftsmanship. Some drivers installed extra fuel tanks to extend range, and a few rigged their cars with devices that could release an oil slick on the road behind them to discourage pursuit, an innovation that is difficult to source to a single inventor, but which several men of this era seem to have arrived at independently. The routes themselves were works of practical geography. A good rum runner knew every back road, every friendly farm where he could pull off and wait, every stretch where the surface was reliable enough to hold speed, and every bridge that had the clearance for a loaded vehicle. He knew which local law enforcement was sympathetic, which was corrupt in a useful direction, and which was the genuine problem. He knew the schedules, to the extent that schedules could be known, of the federal agents operating in his territory. The pay was good, considerably better than most legal employment available to a young man in a rural area in the 1920s, which is not a coincidence, but rather the economic logic of Prohibition made plain. A successful run could pay a week's wages in a single night. Several successful runs a week could make a man comfortable in a way that farming or millwork never would. And there was, alongside the money, the undeniable pull of the thing itself, the speed, the dark roads, the self-reliance, the quiet satisfaction of a delivery completed without incident. The roads are empty. You make the drop at a prearranged location, a barn, a back door, an intermediary who asks no questions and hands you an envelope. You count the money in your car by the light of a match. Then you drive home, slowly, on the main road, because a man driving slowly on the main road at 3 a.m. is just a man who is out late. Everything is fine. You'll do it again Thursday. Let's talk about boxing, and specifically about the 1920s version of it, which was not just a professional sport but a deeply personal civic pastime. In this era, boxing gyms could be found in nearly every city and many small towns, and the assumption was that any man worth his flat cap should be able to handle himself in the ring, Not necessarily well, but at least with some dignity. Amateur boxing clubs attracted men of all ages, professions and physical conditions, united by the shared belief that voluntarily getting hit in the face was character building, which is an argument that gets less convincing the more times you've been hit in the face. You are standing in a gymnasium that smells like leather sweat and the specific industrial cleaning product that is apparently standard issue at every boxing gym in human history. You're wearing gloves that are slightly too large for your hands and shoes that are slightly too small for your feet. Across the ring from you is a man you know. You work in the same office building, actually. You have eaten lunch near each other, and he is looking at you with an expression of concentrated calm that you find more alarming than aggression. The bell rings. This is your idea of Tuesday evening. Amateur boxing in the 1920s was inseparable from the professional spectacle that surrounded it. Jack Dempsey was the heavyweight champion of the world from 1919 to 1926, and his public profile was enormous. His fights were national events reported in newspapers across the country, and his style of aggressive, forward-pressing, heavy-handed boxing was imitated by young men in gyms from New York to San Francisco. Dempsey fought with a kind of physical intensity that made the sport look simultaneously terrifying and deeply appealing, which is a combination that has reliably caused men to sign up for things throughout history. The YMCA was a significant institutional presence in amateur boxing during this era. YMCA gyms in cities and towns across America offered boxing instruction as part of their physical fitness programming, framing the sport in terms of health, discipline, and moral development, the idea being that learning to box taught a young man self-control, physical confidence, and the ability to absorb difficulty without panic. This was a popular argument and not entirely incorrect, though it did tend to gloss over the part where you were repeatedly hit in the head by other men who were also building character. The social function of the boxing gym was also significant. In immigrant communities and working-class neighborhoods, the gym was a place where men gathered, established relationships, tested themselves, and built local reputations. Irish American, Italian American, and Jewish American communities in particular had strong boxing cultures, producing competitive amateur programs and a steady supply of professional talent. The gym was, in this context, both a sporting venue and a social institution, a place where a young man could make himself known, demonstrate his willingness to compete, and connect with the community. The equipment was simple: gloves, wraps, a heavy bag, a speed bag, a ring with 4 ropes. The instruction varied from technically sophisticated to roughly approximated. Many amateur trainers were former fighters who taught from experience rather than theory, and the lessons they passed on were practical and direct. Keep your hands up, move your head, don't telegraph the right hand, don't back straight up. These were the fundamentals, and most of the men in the gym were still working on them while also somehow finding themselves in actual sparring sessions. Round 3. You're tired in a way that the first 2 rounds did not prepare you for. Your arms are heavier than they were. The man across from you is still calm, which continues to be a problem. He lands a right hand on your jaw, not hard, but firmly, the way a teacher might tap a desk to make a point. You blink. The bell rings. You both nod at each other, breathing hard. and there is something in that nod that has no equivalent in any other social interaction. A mutual acknowledgement that you were both just in there, both working, both sustaining and delivering, and that this means something even if neither of you could explain exactly what. Let's talk about endurance swimming, which in the 1920s became the kind of activity that could make you genuinely famous if you survived it. Long-distance swimming had been a competitive sport since the 1800s, but in the Jazz Age it exploded into a full-blown national obsession. Men, and with increasing frequency, women, began attempting to swim across large bodies of water that most sensible people would have crossed in a boat. The English Channel, Lake Michigan, the Hudson River, bodies of water with currents and cold temperatures and wildlife and shipping traffic, all of which were apparently considered acceptable obstacles rather than reasons to reconsider. You are 2 miles offshore in Lake Michigan, and the water is 54 degrees Fahrenheit, which is cold in the way that descriptions fail to capture. Cold not as a temperature but as a physical presence that has inserted itself into your body and is conducting negotiations with your muscles about how much longer they plan to continue working. The shore is visible. It is not close. There is a rowboat a few yards off your left shoulder with a man in it who is theoretically your support crew, and he is watching you with an expression that is either encouragement or concern, and at this distance it is difficult to say which. Endurance swimming occupied a specific cultural space in the 1920s that had as much to do with spectacle and celebrity as it did with athletics. The English Channel was the gold standard, a 21-mile crossing through cold, rough, unpredictable water that had defeated most who attempted it since Matthew Webb became the first to complete it in 1875. In 1926, Gertrude Ederle became the first woman to swim the Channel and broke the men's record by nearly 2 hours, which caused an enormous public sensation, and also caused a number of men to quietly reconsider their position on several things. American endurance swimming was organized around a circuit of significant crossings: the Hudson River, Manhattan Island, Lake Ontario, Boston Harbor, the Catalina Channel off California, each one a recognized challenge with its own established records and its own community of competitors. Organizers and newspapers sponsored attempts, offering prize money for successful crossings and coverage for the attempt regardless of outcome. Because a swimmer struggling through cold water for 12 hours and either succeeding or failing was good copy either way. The physical demands were extreme. Cold water was the most consistent enemy. Swimmers greased their bodies with lanolin or petroleum jelly to provide some insulation against the temperature, and some wore wool undergarments beneath their bathing suits. Currents could extend the actual distance swum far beyond the straight-line measurement. Jellyfish, boat traffic, and the psychological grinding monotony of open water were all factors that had to be managed over the course of what could be a 12, 16, or 20-hour effort. The men who competed in this circuit were a specific type. They were strong swimmers, obviously, but physical strength was not the primary qualification. The primary qualification was the ability to keep going when nothing about the situation recommended continuing, when the water was cold and the destination was not noticeably closer, and the support boat was watching and the question forming in the exhausted mind was not so much "can I do this" as "why did I decide that I should?" The answer to that question had to be settled before the swimmer entered the water, because it was not something that could be worked out in the middle of Lake Michigan at 3 in the morning. 4 miles. The water is still 54 degrees. Your stroke has gotten shorter and slower than it was at the start, but it has not stopped, which is the thing that matters. The shore is measurably closer now. You can make out individual features of the landscape, which at the beginning were just a blur. The man in the rowboat says something encouraging. You do not respond because turning your head to speak costs energy you have allocated elsewhere. You swim. The water is cold. You swim anyway. Let's talk about high diving, which in the 1920s was both a legitimate sporting competition and a form of public spectacle that drew enormous crowds. Men would climb to platforms positioned 50, 75, or sometimes 100 feet above a pool or a lake, pausing at the top for dramatic effect, which was important, and then throw themselves into the air and plummet downward at a speed that is difficult to describe as anything other than alarming. The dive itself lasted perhaps 2 seconds. The recovery, if everything went correctly, was immediate. If everything did not go correctly, it was a matter for the medical tent. You're standing on a platform 80 feet above a pool at an outdoor exhibition in Atlantic City. The crowd below is real and large and looking up at you. You can see their faces, small, expectant, tipped toward the sky. The pool below is correct in terms of depth, you have been told, and you have been told this by people whose job it is to know, and you are choosing to trust them, because trusting them is the only option available at this particular height. The platform under your feet is perhaps 3 feet by 3 feet. The air around you is early summer, warm, with a light breeze that is moving in a direction you are factoring into your entry angle. You look down. This part never gets easier, no matter how many times you do it. Competitive high diving had been included in the Olympic program since 1900, and by the 1920s it was an established sporting discipline with recognized international competitors. Platform diving from heights of 10 meters, roughly 33 feet, was the standard competition format, but the entertainment circuit operated on different terms, and the heights deployed for public spectacle were considerably greater. Exhibition divers at fairs, resorts, and waterfront attractions performed from platforms of 80, 90, or 100 feet, heights that took the dive out of the athletic category and placed it firmly into something closer to a demonstration of extreme commitment. The mechanics of a high dive from extreme heights are not complicated, but are deeply unforgiving. The diver enters the water at speeds of around 40 miles per hour from a 100-foot platform, fast enough that the surface tension of the water is a significant force. An entry angle becomes critical in ways it simply is not from 10 feet. A clean, arrow-straight vertical entry dissipates that force across the full length of the body. Any deviation, any rotation, any flinching, any failure to maintain form through the full fall redirects that force into vulnerable parts of the body. The shoulders, wrists, and neck were the most commonly injured. A bad entry from 100 feet did not feel like a bad dive. It felt like an argument with something that was not interested in the other side of the case. The performers who worked the exhibition circuit developed their craft through years of incremental training, adding height gradually, building the physical confidence and the mental management of height that the work required. They were also in most cases exceptional showmen. The theatrical element of the act was as important as the technical one. The pause at the top of the platform, hands on hips looking out at the crowd, was standard practice, not vanity. It built the audience's anticipation to a point where the dive itself felt like a release. Some performers incorporated flaming pools, additional height via a springboard off the platform edge, or a series of somersaults during the descent that added rotation to the already considerable demands of the entry. Onlookers were enthusiastic in ways that the divers sometimes found complicated. Crowds cheered the dangerous acts most loudly, which created a financial incentive to push the heights further and the stunts closer to the edge of what was manageable. Exhibition promoters were not above exaggerating platform heights in their advertising, which sometimes meant a diver arrived to find the setup somewhat different from what had been described. This was the kind of professional hazard that you managed with a calm assessment of the actual height, a recalibration of your approach, and an expression that communicated to the crowd that everything was proceeding exactly as intended. You push off the platform, the air rushes past in a way that is total and immediate. Your body arranges itself, arms at your sides, toes pointed, the slight forward lean that will bring you into the water at the angle you have spent years practicing. 2 seconds. The water surface expands toward you at a speed that is impressive and not negotiable. And then the entry, the cold and the force and the sudden roaring silence of the underwater, and then you are rising toward the surface, and the crowd above is already making the sound that means it went right. That means you are fine. That means they are clapping for you, and you break the surface and raise one hand, and everything is exactly as it should be. Let's talk about the Wall of Death, which is a carnival attraction where a man gets on a motorcycle and rides it in circles inside a large wooden barrel, going sideways at speed, defying the laws of physics in a way that takes a moment to fully process. The Wall of Death arrived in American carnivals sometime in the late teens and became one of the defining spectacles of the 1920s fairground circuit. Riders would push their motorcycles to speeds of up to 30 or 40 miles per hour inside a cylindrical wooden drum roughly 15 feet tall, the centrifugal force keeping them pinned to the wall, their faces pointed outward at a crowd of people who had paid a nickel to stand on a platform and look down at what was happening with their mouths open. You are inside the drum now. The engine noise in here is extraordinary, not loud in the way that traffic is loud, but loud in the that the sound has nowhere to go and simply fills the cylinder from floor to ceiling like a physical substance. The wooden wall curves past your right shoulder at a distance of perhaps 18 inches. You're travelling at 35 miles per hour. You are horizontal. The ground, which is below you in the conventional sense but is currently functioning as a wall, is directly to your right. The crowd above you, ringed around the open top of the drum on a wooden observation platform, is looking straight down at you. You look up at them. Several of them look uncomfortable. You are fine. The Wall of Death, also called the Motordrome, the Silodrome, Or, in certain promotional materials, the most dangerous act in the world, which was competitive but not unreasonable, was a genuine feat of applied physics dressed up as entertainment. The principle at work was centrifugal force. A motorcycle travelling fast enough along the inside surface of a curved wall generates outward force sufficient to keep both tyres in contact with the wood, overcoming gravity entirely as long as the speed is maintained. The critical word there is maintained. Drop below the minimum speed, somewhere around 17 miles per hour for a standard drum, and the force balance tips, and the motorcycle and its rider return to a relationship with gravity that is sudden and unpleasant. The riders who worked the Wall of Death circuit were a specific breed of performer, part athlete, part mechanic, part showman. They maintained their own machines with the focused attention of people whose lives were directly connected to the quality of their maintenance. The motorcycles used were typically light, nimble machines, Indians and Harleys modified for the drum work, with the suspension adjusted for the unique demands of riding perpendicular to the ground. A mechanical failure inside the drum did not play out the same way a mechanical failure on a road did. There was nowhere to go. There was only the wall and the floor, and the speed that was either sufficient or was not. The showmanship was important. Riders developed signature acts within the drum, riding with no hands, standing on the seat, riding with a passenger on the handlebars, and in the most celebrated variation, sharing the drum with the lion. Several Wall of Death performers in the 1920s incorporated live lions into their acts, the animal riding in a sidecar or simply occupying the drum alongside the motorcycle, which was either a statement about the depth of human showmanship or a sign that the competitive pressure of the carnival circuit had reached a point where adding a lion seemed like the logical next step. The crowds for the lion acts were considerably larger than for the standard show. The fairground context mattered. The Wall of Death sat alongside the bearded lady, the strong man, the fortune teller, and the shooting gallery, part of a tradition of paid spectacle that the 1920s fairground audience consumed with enormous appetite. Admission to stand on the platform and look down was typically 10 cents. For that dime, you got 2 minutes of a man riding sideways on a motorcycle inside a wooden barrel, possibly accompanied by a large predatory cat, and you walked away with the slightly dazed expression of someone who has seen something their brain is still processing. The drum echoes, the engine screams. You complete another circuit and another, and look up at the faces above you, the open mouths, the pointed fingers, the children being held up to see over the railing by parents who will later question that decision. You are doing something that looks impossible from up there. From down here, it is simply fast and loud, and exactly the thing you have chosen to do with your life, which is a sentence that when you say it aloud at family gatherings tends to generate a long silence. Let's talk about stunt driving, which is the noble art of making an automobile do things that automobiles were never designed to do in front of as many people as possible with minimal protective equipment. Stunt drivers in the 1920s were among the most celebrated men in show business. They toured state fairs, appeared at automobile exhibitions, performed at racetracks, and occasionally lent their skills to the early Hollywood film industry. which was discovering that audiences would pay to see almost anything as long as it involved a car going very fast and then doing something catastrophic. You are behind the wheel of a modified Ford, and in approximately 40 seconds you're going to drive it off a ramp at 60 miles per hour and attempt to clear a gap of 40 feet before landing on a second ramp on the other side. The crowd at the county fairgrounds is large and has paid specifically to see this. The ramp ahead is solid pine construction, built this morning by a crew who seemed confident about the angles involved. You have done this before. Not this exact ramp, not this exact gap, not this exact car, but the principle is the same, and the principle is sound, and you have told yourself this enough times over the past hour that it has become something close to a belief. Stunt driving as a formal entertainment discipline emerged alongside the automobile itself, but the 1920s gave it a new scale and a new audience. The explosion of car ownership during the decade meant that the automobile was part of everyday life for millions of Americans, and watching someone do extraordinary and inadvisable things with one carried a particular charge, a combination of recognition and transgression. The thrill of seeing something familiar pushed far beyond its intended operating parameters. It was, in a sense, the same appeal as watching a man do something you could imagine attempting and immediately deciding not to. The stunt repertoire of the era was extensive. Broadside skids sliding the arse sideways into a controlled drift were a crowd favourite that required both mechanical understanding and a level of steering precision that most drivers of the era did not possess, and that stunt drivers developed through relentless practice. The jump was the centerpiece of most shows. The ramp and gap, or ramp and water, or ramp and line of cars jump that delivered the maximum combination of height, speed, and consequence. Rolling the car was another standard act, deliberately inducing a roll at speed, sometimes down a hill, sometimes off a small ramp, and relying on a reinforced roof structure and a driver's cage of iron, piping to prevent the outcome from being definitive. The Hollywood connection was significant and mutually beneficial. The film industry in the 1920s was consuming stunt work at an enormous rate. Chase sequences, crashes, rollovers, and narrow escapes were among the most commercially reliable elements of the silent film era, and directors needed men who could deliver them reliably and repeatably. Stunt drivers moved between the fair circuit and the studio lots, some becoming permanently attached to the studios, others maintaining their touring shows and appearing in films as schedules permitted. The cars themselves were substantially modified, though their modifications were not always visible to the audience. Rolls were prepared with reinforced roll cages and sometimes with the driver restrained by a leather harness, bolted to the frame, an early version of the safety equipment that would not become standard on road cars for another half-century. Jumps required the suspension to be stiffened to prevent the car from bottoming catastrophically on landing. Engines were frequently upgraded. Everything that could be reinforced was reinforced, which covered a significant portion of the car's structure, but not, it must be acknowledged, all of it. The ramp rises. The car hits the incline and the front end lifts, and for a moment the windshield frames nothing but blue sky, and then the sky tilts and the ground comes up to meet you at a speed that would concern you if you had time to be concerned, and the landing hits through the tires and the suspension and the seat, and your hands and your spine and your jaw, all at once, and the crowd exhales in a single collective breath. The car is still moving. You are still in it. You bring it around in a broad controlled arc, facing the grandstand, and you lift one hand off the wheel. The noise the crowd makes is the specific noise of people who are very glad something turned out to be fine. Let's talk about eating contests, because apparently in the 1920s, a man's capacity to consume food at an inhuman speed was considered both a talent and a point of civic pride. Competitive eating events had existed in America for decades, often organized around local fairs, political rallies, or the kind of informal community gathering where someone bets someone else they can't eat an entire pie. But in the 20s, with their taste for spectacle and excess, eating contests took on a more organized and more alarming character. Pies, oysters, corn on the cob, watermelon. The competitive categories were many. The portion sizes were upsetting, and the crowds were enthusiastic in a way that suggests they were either very entertained or very relieved it wasn't them up there. You are seated at a long table at a county fair in rural Illinois, and in front of you are 12 ears of corn on the cob, which is the agreed-upon quantity for this particular contest, and which sounded manageable when you entered, and is beginning to sound less so now that they are sitting in front of you in a physical pile. To your left and right are 7 other men in various states of focused preparation. The fairground crowd is arranged in a loose semicircle. A man with a pocket watch is standing at the end of the table. There's a small cash prize for the winner, and a ribbon that you have been thinking about for 2 weeks. Competitive eating in the 1920s occupied a specific cultural niche that was tied to American ideas about abundance, appetite, and a certain kind of physical excess that the decade celebrated across most of its institutions. The economy was booming, the food supply was improving, and the imagery of plenty, of tables loaded with more than anyone needed, carried a positive charge that it would lose in the Depression years to come. An eating contest was, in this context, not just a game, but a kind of performance of prosperity. Look at how much there is. Look at how much a man can hold. The categories varied by region and by what was locally plentiful. Pie-eating contests were perhaps the most universally popular. Apple, cherry, and blueberry pies consumed face first, hands typically behind the back, with speed as the only metric. Oyster-eating contests were fixtures of coastal communities, from the Chesapeake to the Gulf, where the bivalves were cheap and the competition to consume the greatest number, in the shortest time had the additional dramatic element of watching a man work through a quantity of oysters that would register as a medical event in most modern contexts. Watermelon contests were a summer staple across the South and Midwest. The physiological reality of competitive eating at this scale involved a set of skills that were partly learned and partly constitutional. Speed was obviously essential. The ability to chew and swallow rapidly without creating obstructions that slowed the process. But jaw endurance was also a factor, particularly in the corn and pie categories, where continuous chewing over 5 or 10 minutes created a fatigue, that separated the serious competitors from the enthusiastic amateurs. And then there was capacity. The simple question of how much a man's stomach could be convinced to accept before it began objecting in ways that disqualified you from the competition. The social dynamics of these events were rich. Local champions developed reputations that carried genuine weight in their communities. A man known as the county pie-eating champion occupied a specific and honoured position in the social landscape of his town, which tells you something interesting about the 1920s. Challengers travelled to take on established champions. Newspapers covered significant contests. The combination of local pride and digestive achievement was apparently a reliable formula for public interest. Year 7. You are making progress, which is the only honest thing you can say about your position at this point in the contest. The man to your left is on year 9 and has a technique, a rapid rotating motion of the cob, that you're declining to adopt on principle. Your jaw hurts in a specific way that is new in your experience of jaw-related sensations. The crowd is encouraging you by name, which you chose to find motivating rather than alarming. Year 8, this is what you came here to do. Let's talk about tree sitting, which is closely related to flagpole sitting, but introduces the additional variables of branches, wind, birds, and the specific humiliation of being trapped in a tree, because you told everyone you weren't coming down until you broke a record. Tree sitting was one of several altitude-based endurance stunts that flourished in the 1920s alongside flagpole sitting, a kind of philosophical cousin that swapped the clean vertical drama of a metal pole for the more chaotic and organic experience of being genuinely stuck up in a large oak for multiple days, while local newspapers sent reporters to document your descent into delirium. You have been in this tree for 4 days. The tree is an elm, approximately 40 feet tall, located in the town square of a mid-sized city in Ohio, and when you climbed it on Monday morning with a bedroll, a supply of provisions lowered to you twice daily in a bucket on a rope, and a handwritten note explaining your intentions, the crowd that gathered was substantial. It is now Thursday afternoon, and the crowd is smaller but loyal, a rotating cast of townspeople who stop by on their lunch hours or after work to look up at you and confirm that you are, in fact, still there. You wave, they wave back. This is your life right now. Tree sitting emerged as part of the same cultural wave that produced flagpole sitting and marathon dancing, and all the other endurance spectacles of the era, a collective national interest in human persistence that the 1920s seemed to generate in unusual quantities. If flagpole sitting was the purest form of the discipline, a clean geometric challenge, one man, one pole, vertical precision, tree sitting was its more complicated, less dignified cousin. Trees were irregular. They had branches that dug into you at unpredictable angles. They swayed in wind in a way that poles being fixed steel did not. They contained wildlife that had not consented to a human roommate and expressed this through a variety of means. The logistics of an extended tree sit required more planning than the casual observer might suppose. Food and water had to be arranged and delivered. The bucket on a rope system was standard, with supporters on the ground managing the supply. Sleep was the central challenge. A man could not simply close his eyes and let go in a tree, the way a flagpole sitter could doze briefly in a seated position. platforms were sometimes built into the branches before the attempt began, providing a surface wide enough to lie down on, though lie down in this context meant something fairly approximate. A safety rope tied around the sitter's waist was the standard precaution against the most irreversible kind of mistake. The motivations for tree sitting range from genuine competition. Newspapers and promoters sometimes organised formal contests with cash prizes, to pure local celebrity, to the specific young male psychology of committing to something publicly and then being unable to back down without the cost to personal reputation being too high to absorb. Small-town newspapers covered these events with the earnest detail of genuine news items, reporting on the sitters' physical condition, their morale, the quantity of food being consumed, and any notable incidents during the attempt. A thunderstorm, a particularly aggressive squirrel, a visit from a local official asking questions about the permit situation. The physical experience of extended tree sitting was, by most accounts, a specific kind of misery that had its own internal logic. The first day was uncomfortable. The second day was worse. By the third day, something shifted, not into comfort, but into a kind of stubborn acceptance of the current condition as simply the condition, full stop. Men who completed long tree sits often described a detached, almost meditative quality to the later stages, a narrowing of the world to the immediate, the light through the leaves, the sound of the town below, the twice-daily bucket that had something in common with the descriptions of other forms of extreme endurance. Day 4 becomes day 5. The elm sways lightly in a breeze that, up here, is more present than it is on the ground. The bucket arrives at noon. Soup, bread, a newspaper, a note from someone you don't know wishing you luck. Below, a small boy is pointing up at you and saying something to his mother. You can't hear what. You wave at him. He waves back with both arms with the full commitment that only children bring to waving, and for a moment the tree, the town, the 4 days, the aching back, the bucket on a rope, all of it feels improbably worth it. Let's talk about the rodeo, which in the 1920s had transformed from a rough cattle industry tradition into one of the most popular and well-attended spectator sports in the American West, and was rapidly spreading east to audiences who had never been within 50 miles of a working ranch, but were absolutely enthralled by the idea of a man getting on a horse that had made its feelings on the matter extremely clear. Rodeo events included bronc riding, bull riding, calf roping, steer wrestling and barrel racing, each of which involved either an angry animal, a large rope, or a combination of both, and each of which required its participants to have cultivated a very specific relationship with physical pain. You're sitting on a horse in a chute, and the horse does not want you there. This is, in fact, the entire premise of the event. The horse has been selected specifically because it objects to being ridden with an intensity and creativity that makes it useful for competitive purposes, and you have climbed onto it anyway because you are a bronc rider, and this is what bronc riders do. They climb onto horses that don't want them, and then attempt to stay there for 8 seconds while the horse deploys every physical argument in its considerable arsenal. 8 seconds sounds like a very short time until you're in the chute waiting for the gate to open, at which point it reveals itself to be a philosophical eternity. The 1920s rodeo circuit was a professional enterprise with genuine stakes. Major events like Cheyenne Frontier Days, which had been running since 1897, drew tens of thousands of spectators and offered prize money that attracted competitors from across the West and increasingly from the East, where the cowboy had been elevated by popular culture into an iconic American figure. Wild West shows had been touring the country for decades, and the rodeo existed in their cultural shadow, while also being a distinct and more authentically competitive form. Real ranch skills, performed under contest conditions judged on both form and result. Bronc riding was the signature event. A rider had to stay mounted on a bucking horse for 8 seconds, a rule that had been standardized by the early 20s, while holding one hand in the air and spurring the horse forward in a technique that scored points and also, paradoxically, encouraged the horse to buck harder. The horses were professionals in their own right, animals with established reputations and names, known to the circuit the way opposing pitchers are known to baseball batters. A horse called 5 minutes to midnight or I will shiver was a known quantity, its tendencies and patterns studied by the riders who drew it, the way a chess player might study a known opponent's openings. Steer wrestling, also called bulldogging, was a different order of activity entirely. In this event, a rider galloped his horse alongside a running steer, then launched himself off the horse, grabbed the steer by the horns, and used his body weight and leverage to bring the animal to the ground, stopping the clock when all 4 of the steer's legs were extended and it was flat. The steers weighed between 500 and 700 pounds. The riders launched themselves at the animals from horseback at full gallop. The physics of the event were, to put it gently, unforgiving of errors in judgment, timing or grip. Calf roping was a test of speed, horsemanship and rope skill. A rider had to rope a running calf from horseback, dismount and tie 3 of the calf's legs together in the fastest possible time. The best ropers in the circuit could complete this in under 20 seconds, which required a synchronization between horse, rope and rider that took years to develop and was genuinely beautiful to watch when executed by someone at the top of the form. The gate opens. The horse explodes from the chute in the way that horses explode from chutes, with a violence that is immediate and total, and that moves through your spine and your hands and your teeth all at once. The crowd noise is there somewhere, a background fact. Your whole world is the horse, the 8 seconds, the angle of your spur on the forward kick. 3 seconds, 4. The horse drops its head and drives its hindquarters skyward in the move that has unseated better riders than you. You stay. 5 seconds, 6. The crowd is very loud now. 7, 8. The horn sounds. You are still on. Somewhere below you the ground is waiting, as it always is, patient, prepared, ready for whenever you come back to it. Let's talk about rocking chair contests, which were exactly what they sound like, and which were somehow popular enough to deserve their own entry in the long list of 1920s endurance spectacles. In a decade full of men competing to stay awake the longest while doing things, dancing, cycling, sitting on poles, someone eventually arrived at the logical conclusion that you could also compete to sit in a rocking chair for the longest amount of time, and that this would draw a crowd. They were not wrong. Rocking chair endurance contests were held in department stores, hotel lobbies, and public parks across America, and they attracted genuine audiences and genuine competitors who sat there rocking with the serene, hollow focus of a man who has decided that stillness is its own kind of violence. You have been in this rocking chair for 22 hours. The chair is a standard wooden rocker, not uncomfortable by normal rocking chair standards. But the phrase normal rocking chair standards implies a usage of perhaps an hour at a time, perhaps an evening on a porch, perhaps a quiet Sunday afternoon. It does not imply 22 consecutive hours of occupancy, during which the chair's dimensions have revealed themselves to be precisely calibrated to produce a slow, comprehensive map of human anatomical vulnerability. Your lower back would like to file a complaint. Your elbows have opinions. You rock anyway because stopping the chair means disqualification, and you did not come here to be disqualified. The rocking chair contest was, in its way, the purest distillation of the 1920s endurance craze, stripped of all athletic pretense, all physical spectacle, all the drama of speed or height or water temperature. What remained was simply the question: how long can you keep going when there is nothing to keep you going except the decision to keep going? It was, in a sense, a philosophical experiment conducted in furniture, and the fact that substantial numbers of American men chose to participate in it says something interesting about the decade's appetite for competitive suffering. The events were typically organized by commercial establishments looking for promotional attention. A department store in Baltimore or a hotel in Chicago would announce a rocking chair contest, provide a row of chairs in a prominent location, offer a cash prize for the last person rocking, and then invite the public to participate and observe. The public reliably came to do both. Spectators gathered to watch the contestants in the same spirit they brought to dance marathons. The entertainment value of watching human beings push through fatigue to all the far edges of what they would voluntarily endure. The rules were simple, but the enforcement was contested. The chair had to be in continuous motion. Stopping the rock even briefly was grounds for elimination. Sleep was permitted as long as the rocking continued. And this became the central skill of the serious competitor, the ability to enter a shallow, continuous doze while maintaining enough motor activity in the legs to keep the chair moving. It was an unusual form of consciousness, and the men who could sustain it for longest were not necessarily the most physically robust, but the most capable of detaching their deliberate minds from their bodies and trusting that something more automatic would keep the chair in motion. Competitors developed techniques. Some rocked aggressively in the early hours to establish a rhythm their bodies would maintain automatically. Others rocked minimally from the start, conserving energy for the long middle of the contest. Food and water were brought to contestants by attendants, eating in a rocking chair being an experience that combined two already modest activities into something that somehow added up to less than either. Hour 23. The hotel lobby is quieter now. The late-night thinning of the spectator crowd that every long endurance event produces. A few dedicated observers remain in chairs of their own, watching from a comfortable distance with the relaxed attention of people who have made a better set of choices this evening. Your rocker creaks with each cycle, a sound that has long since stopped registering as a sound and becomes simply the texture of time passing. You rock forward, you rock back. Somewhere in your body, a very tired, very stubborn person has taken charge, and that person has decided, without drama or particular feeling, that the chair is going to keep moving until someone tells them the contest is over. It is not excitement. It is not suffering exactly. It is just the thing that is happening, and you are the person it is happening to, and the chair rocks on. Let's talk about football in the 1920s, which is recognisable as the same game played today in roughly the same way that a butter churn is recognisable as the same technology as a modern kitchen appliance. The rules were different. The equipment was different. Specifically, the helmets were made of leather and offered approximately the structural protection of a hat. The fields were different. The culture was different, and the men who played the game were operating under a shared understanding that football was something you played until your body told you firmly to stop, and even then you probably played one more quarter. You're a lineman on a college football team in the autumn of 1923, and you're about to run a play in which your primary responsibility is to collide with another large man as forcefully as possible, so that a third man can move a few yards in a direction. This is, reduced to its elements, what football is. The leather helmet on your head is thin, padded internally with perhaps a quarter-inch of felt, and it fits with the snugness of a well-tailored cap. It will protect you from the specific discomfort of having turf pushed into your scalp. It will not do a great deal beyond that. You know this. Everyone on this field knows this. The game proceeds. Professional football in the 1920s was in its organisational infancy. The National Football League had been formally established in 1920, but the professional game was still significantly overshadowed by the college game in public attention, attendance, and cultural prestige. The great college programs, Notre Dame, Illinois, Michigan, Yale, were the focal points of the sport, and their games drew enormous crowds and generated national newspaper coverage. Notre Dame under coach Newt Rockner was perhaps the dominant program of the decade, producing teams of such consistent excellence and cultivating such a mythology of discipline, sacrifice, and collective purpose that Rockner's name became essentially synonymous with the sport in the popular imagination. The gameplay itself was considerably different from the modern version. Forward passes had been legalised in 1906, but the passing game was still a supplementary rather than central element of most offences. The dominant strategy was the running game, built on the ability of large men to create space through force and smaller men to exploit that space quickly. Substitution rules were restrictive in ways that meant players frequently played both offense and defense. The concept of the specialized player, the man brought in for one specific function, was not yet the organizing principle of the sport that it would later become. Men played through injuries that would sideline a modern player for weeks. This was not considered unusual. This was considered playing football. The equipment situation bears examination because it is one of those historical details that seems, from a modern vantage point, so different as to be barely recognizable as the same sport. Leather helmets were standard but not universal. Some players chose not to wear them, a decision their future selves would have complicated feelings about if their future selves were in any condition to have feelings. Pads were minimal, leather or felt shoulder pads, hip pads and knee pads of a construction that addressed the concept of protection without fully delivering on it. The field itself was typically natural grass, often in the condition that natural grass fields achieve after a season of use in the American autumn, which is to say significant portions of it were mud. Red Grange was the decade's transcendent college player, the galloping ghost of Illinois, whose speed and elusiveness made him a genuine national celebrity, and whose career helped bridge the gap between the college game's prestige and the professional game's ambitions. When Grange turned professional in 1925, signing with the Chicago Bears immediately after his final college game, the resulting publicity tour drew massive crowds to NFL games and demonstrated that professional football had a commercial future it had not yet fully found. Third and short, the ball is snapped. You drive forward into the man across from you, shoulder to chest, feet churning, the physics of the collision playing out in your legs and back and neck. The pile resolves. The runner gets the yards. You unpile yourself from the ground. Your helmet is slightly askew. You straighten it with one hand, settle back into your stance, and wait for the next snap. Your body is recording all of this in a way you are not currently processing. That is a problem for later. Right now there is a game, and you are in it, and the autumn air is cold and sharp, and the crowd is making noise. And this, precisely this, is what Saturday is for. Let's talk about pedestrianism, which is the competitive sport of walking very long distances as fast as possible, and which was experiencing a significant revival in the 1920s after its original peak of popularity in the 1800s. Pedestrian races, or go-as-you-please contests, which allowed competitors to walk or run as they chose, had once filled arenas and created genuine national celebrities. By the Jazz Age, the format had evolved into long-distance road races, cross-country walking contests, and the kind of event where a man would announce he was going to walk from, say, New York to Los Angeles, and then simply do it, collecting newspaper coverage along the way like a person collecting receipts. You're on day 11 of a walk from Chicago to New York, and you're somewhere in western Pennsylvania, which is a sentence that contains its own specific kind of discouragement. The road ahead rises into hills that the morning light is making look more dramatic than necessary. Your feet are wrapped in the way that long-distance walkers wrap their feet. Multiple layers of sock, specific placements of padding. A system developed through the particular education of having done this long enough to know what goes wrong and in what order. Your pack is modest. A change of clothes, a kit for foot care, a small amount of food, a letter of introduction from the Chicago newspaper that is nominally sponsoring this endeavour. Pedestrianism had been the spectator sport of the 1870s and 80s, 6-day walking races in Madison Square Garden, men walking enormous distances inside arenas while crowds watched and bet, and ate and drank, and went home and came back, following the lap counts the way modern fans follow box scores. Edward Payson Weston was the era's defining figure, a walker who had completed extraordinary distances, including a walk from Portland, Maine to Chicago at the age of 70, and whose longevity and continued competitive activity into the 1920s made him a living link between the sport's golden era and its Jazz Age revival. The 1920s version of long-distance pedestrianism was less arena-based and more road-oriented. Transcontinental walks were the prestige events, journeys from coast to coast that took months and generated sustained newspaper coverage, with the walker checking in at towns along the route, being received by local officials, speaking to gatherings of interested citizens, and generally functioning as a one-man travelling exhibition of human endurance. The walks were partially commercial enterprises. Walkers collected small appearance fees, sold photographs, accepted donations, and partially pure competition, the goal being to establish or break existing time records for specific routes. The physical discipline required was different from running in ways that were not always obvious to observers. Walking at a competitive pace for 8 to 12 hours a day, day after day, produced a specific set of physical demands and a specific set of vulnerabilities. The feet bore the most obvious burden. Blisters, calluses, and stress injuries to the tendons and bones were universal, and the management of foot condition was the daily obsessive focus of any serious long-distance walker. Shoes were changed frequently. Socks were inspected and replaced with a clinical attention that would have seemed eccentric in any other context. The ritual of the evening foot examination was as important as the miles logged. The mental dimension was what separated the serious walkers from the enthusiastic amateurs who started transcontinental attempts and abandoned them in Kansas. The road, after 2 weeks, was not stimulating. It was simply the road, mile after mile of the same experience, differentiated by weather and terrain, but essentially the same thing, hour after hour, day after day. The walkers who completed great distances had learned to occupy this repetition without fighting it, to find in the rhythm of the stride a kind of moving meditation, the world reduced to the road surface immediately ahead and the next town on the map. Western Pennsylvania recedes. The hills are behind you now, which is the relevant fact, and Ohio is ahead, and Ohio is flat in a way that Pennsylvania emphatically was not. Your stride lengthens slightly on the descent into the valley. The morning sun is fully up. Your feet for the moment are merely present rather than a source of complaint. There are perhaps 20 miles to the next town, and in the next town there is a newspaper correspondent who is going to write about you. And somewhere beyond that there is New York, and you're walking to it 1 mile at a time, which is the only way anyone has ever walked anywhere. Let's talk about pool halls, which in the 1920s occupied a very specific and slightly disreputable place in American social life. Somewhere between a gentleman's club and a place where you could lose your paycheck on a Thursday afternoon and tell your wife you'd been at work. Billiards and pool had been popular since the mid-19th century, but in the 20s the pool hall became a genuine cultural institution, especially in cities where every neighbourhood seemed to have at least one, usually dimly lit, usually smoke-filled, usually containing at least one man who was either very good at pool or very good at pretending to be. You push open the door and the smell of the pool hall reaches you before the light does. Chalk dust, cigarette smoke, the faint undertone of coffee from a pot on a hot plate behind the counter, and something else that is harder to name, something that is just the accumulated atmosphere of many hours of men standing in dimly lit rooms, concentrating very hard on small objects. The room is long and narrow. 6 tables run down the length of it, each lit from above by a low-hanging lamp that creates a bright island of green felt surrounded by comfortable shadow. 3 of the tables are occupied. From the far end of the room, the clean, sharp crack of a well-struck ball. The pool hall, as a social institution in the 1920s, carried a particular cultural weight that was partly about class and partly about geography. In working-class neighbourhoods, the pool hall was a community gathering point, a place where men could spend time that had no productive purpose without the social cost of simply sitting at home doing nothing. It was leisure legitimised by mild competition, time organised around the satisfying geometry of felt and a ball and pocket. The small stakes wagering that accompanied most games added a frisson of risk that kept the atmosphere from tipping into pure relaxation, which would apparently have been one step too far. The games played were varied. Straight pool, sometimes called 14-1 continuous, was the prestige game, requiring a combination of ball-making skill and strategic thinking about position that separated serious players from casual ones. 8-ball and 9-ball were popular for their faster pace and simpler structure. Carom billiards, played on a pocketless table, scoring points by striking 2 object balls with the cue ball, was considered the most technically demanding discipline and attracted a more formally competitive subset of players. Each game had its community of practitioners and its local champions, and its evolving body of strategic knowledge passed from player to player through direct observation and quiet conversation. The shark, the player who concealed his actual ability in order to draw favourable wagers, was a genuine social type in the 1920s pool hall, and recognising one was a survival skill worth developing before money changed hands. A man who played loosely and erratically for the first several games, who made casual conversation about how he hadn't really played in a while, who seemed genuinely uncertain about certain shots. This man might be exactly what he appeared to be, or he might be operating a very patient setup. The cultural figure of the pool shark was sufficiently established by the 1920s that it had its own mythology, its own celebrated practitioners, and its own cautionary tales that circulated through pool halls the way fish stories circulate among fishermen. Willie Hop was the decade's most celebrated professional billiards player, a former child prodigy who had been dominating carom billiards at the World Championship level since 1906, and who continued to compete and win through the 20s with a technical mastery that contemporary observers described in the reverent terms usually reserved for virtuoso musicians. Professional billiards tournaments drew genuine spectator audiences during this period, and the best players were legitimate public figures with fan followings and newspaper coverage. The table in the corner opens up. You rack. The chalk squeaks against the tip of the cue in the way it always does, a sound so embedded in this specific experience that it functions almost as a ritual, a signal that something focused and satisfying is about to begin. The break scatters the balls across the green in a way that contains its own specific information, a set of positions from which the rest of the game will unfold. You study the table for a moment. Someone behind you lights a cigarette. The lamp above the table hums very quietly. You lean down and take the shot, and the sound it makes is exactly the sound you wanted, clean and certain in the room's pleasant dimness. Let's talk about cold water plunging, which is the practice of voluntarily entering water that is trying its absolute hardest to discourage you from doing that, and which was considered in the 1920s to be both athletically impressive and vaguely medicinal. Cold water swimming clubs existed in cities across America, their members gathering in winter months to wade into rivers, lakes, and coastal waters that were not warm and had no interest in becoming warmer for anyone's benefit. The men who did this wore bathing costumes, maintained cheerful expressions in the photographs, and spoke about the experience using words like invigorating and bracing, which are two words that have historically been used by people to describe things that are technically terrible, but which they have decided to feel good about. It is February. You're standing at the edge of the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia in a wool bathing suit, and the water in front of you is 38 degrees Fahrenheit and contains, to your knowledge, no feature that could be described as inviting. Around you stand 11 other members of the Polar Bear Club, men ranging in age from their early 20s to improbably their late 60s, who are about to enter this water with you because this is what the club does on Sunday mornings and has done for several years, and which you joined because a friend described it as character building, and you had, in retrospect, a flawed understanding of that phrase. Cold water swimming clubs had their roots in the 19th century European tradition of sea bathing and cold water therapy. The belief, widespread in medical thought of that era, that immersion in cold water provided a range of health benefits including improved circulation, heightened vitality, and a general fortification of the constitution against illness. By the 1920s, the medical rationale had become somewhat vestigial. Most of the men in these clubs were not primarily there for their health, but it persisted as a framing device that allowed grown men to explain to skeptical spouses why they were spending Sunday mornings standing in a frozen river with other men in bathing suits. The experience of cold water immersion is physiologically a very efficient way for the body to convey strong and clear information. The initial entry produces an involuntary gasp, a reflexive inhalation triggered by the skin's cold receptors that cannot be suppressed through intention or preparation, no matter how many times you have done it. The heart rate spikes. The skin goes through a sequence of sensations: sharp cold, then a brief period of burning, then a deeper cold that registers as something less specific and more total, a kind of encompassing fact. The breath shortens and becomes deliberate, and then, after perhaps 30 seconds, something shifts. The initial alarm resolves. The body's emergency response finds its operating level, and what remains is something that is, in its own strange way, genuinely clarifying. The clubs organized their activities with the social formality of more conventional sporting organizations, regular meeting times, membership records, an informal but real set of norms about who you were and how you conducted yourself in and around the water. The group entry was important, not merely as a collective experience but as a practical matter, the buddy system being relevant in cold water, where individual incapacitation was a real possibility, and the window for effective assistance was not wide. Men entered together, stayed near one another, and exited together, the exit being managed with the brisk efficiency of people who have learned that the time between leaving cold water and getting warm clothes on is not a time for lingering. The December and January entries were the most attended. The coldest plunges attracted the most participation, which follows a logic that becomes clear only if you accept that the whole enterprise is about doing the hardest version of something and feeling better afterward than you did before. Men who had been doing this for years described the post-plunge state in terms that range from the merely positive to the actively rhapsodic. A warmth and alertness and sense of well-being that they maintained justified the preceding experience. You are in the water. This is happening. The river is very cold in the specific way that only a river in February is cold. Cold with current, cold with the particular edge of moving water that seems to find and occupy every gap in your resistance. The man next to you exhales a visible cloud of breath. You are all in it together, 11 men in wool suits in a winter river on a Sunday morning, and whatever this is, sport, therapy, madness, tradition, it is very much, completely, irrevocably happening. 30 seconds. You will feel magnificent in about 4 minutes. You have been told this and you have experienced it and you believe it. 30 seconds. Let's talk about human cannonballs, which were exactly what they sound like and which were, during the 1920s, one of the most celebrated and widely attended acts in the American carnival circuit. The Human Cannonball Act, in which a performer is loaded into a large cannon and launched through the air in an arc toward a net, had been a fixture of circus and carnival entertainment since the 1880s. But in the 20s, it reached new heights, both figuratively and, in the case of distance records, quite literally. Performers were launched farther, higher, and over more alarming obstacles than ever before, and audiences stood in the open air and watched, with their necks craned back and their hearts in what can only be described as a complicated place. You are inside the cannon. This is a sentence that takes a moment to absorb even when you are the one living it. The cannon is a large steel cylinder approximately 4 feet in diameter and perhaps 12 feet long, mounted at an angle on a wheeled carriage that the crew positions and repositions for each performance with a care and precision that is, considering what the device does, both reassuring and slightly alarming. You are loaded feet first into the barrel, which is padded internally and smells of gunpowder and canvas and the specific atmosphere of something that has launched human beings before and is prepared to do so again. Outside, muffled by the steel, you can hear the crowd. There are a lot of them. The mechanics of the Human Cannonball Act were not, despite the name and the theatrical smoke and the spectacular bang of the firing, primarily gunpowder-based. The actual propulsive mechanism was a compressed air or spring system housed inside the cannon barrel. The gunpowder charge that accompanied the firing was largely theatrical, producing the flash and the noise that the audience expected, and that made the act feel like what it claimed to be, while the actual work of launching the performer was done by the concealed mechanical system. This was one of the trade secrets of the carnival world, known to the performers and their crews and kept from the audience as a matter of professional convention. The Zacchini family were the era's definitive practitioners, an Italian circus family who had developed the act in the 1910s and brought it to America in the 20s, where they performed for the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, and established the Human Cannonball as one of the signature spectacles of American entertainment. Multiple family members were performers, and their competitive drive to extend the distance record. The farthest any human being had been launched from a cannon and successfully landed pushed the act progressively further, from early distances of perhaps 50 feet to distances, by the late 20s, of more than 150 feet. The net was everything. A human being landing in a net at the end of a 150-foot arc is travelling at a speed of somewhere between 50 and 60 miles per hour, and the net's function was to decelerate that person over a distance long enough to be survivable. A physics problem that the Zacchinis and their contemporaries solved through a combination of net design, positioning, and the performer's own body technique during landing. The approach to the net had to be controlled. Arms, legs, and body angle managed during the flight so that the landing distributed the impact force across the largest possible surface area. A poorly angled entry into the net at that speed was not a minor inconvenience. It was a conversation with consequences. The flight itself lasted perhaps 3 seconds. This was universally described by human cannonball performers as the defining quality of the experience, not the preparation, not the landing, but the 3 seconds in between, during which the performer was entirely and completely in the air, subject to nothing but the arc they had been given, watching the world arrange itself around the trajectory. Some described it as silence. Some described it as the loudest thing they had ever experienced. All of them, when asked whether they would do it again, said yes, with the immediate certainty of people for whom the question has a very obvious answer. The bang fills the carnival grounds. You are airborne. The net is ahead. A pale rectangle in the middle distance, growing rapidly larger, in a way that is either reassuring or alarming, depending on your relationship with speed and trajectory, and yours, at this point, is intimate and specific. The crowd is making a sound that is less like cheering and more like a collective holding of breath. A sound the audience doesn't decide to make but simply makes, because a person just came out of a cannon and is currently flying over their heads, and the human response to that is not a thing that requires deliberation. The net arrives. The landing is solid, absorbing, total. You bounce once, roll to the edge, drop to the ground. You raise both arms. The crowd, which had briefly forgotten to breathe, now remembers, and the noise it makes in that moment of remembering is enormous and warm and very, very loud. Let's talk about wrestling animals, which is one of those things you read about in historical accounts and spend a while just staring at the page. In travelling carnivals and at state fairs across 1920s America, it was possible and not even particularly difficult to find an opportunity to get into a physical contest with a bear or an alligator, or in some cases a kangaroo, which is the one that sounds the most absurd until you learn that kangaroos are extremely strong and will kick you in the chest with both hind legs simultaneously, which is the kind of information that would have been useful before the promotional poster was printed. You're standing in a small roped-off ring at a state fair in the American South, and across from you is a bear. The bear is a trained black bear named something like Colonel or Major or Senator. Carnival bears were almost universally given dignified titles, which was either affectionate or a form of humour that becomes funnier the more you think about it, and he is standing on his hind legs, which puts him at approximately your height, and he is regarding you with the patient, slightly bored expression of a professional who has done this many times and has a settled understanding of how it goes. You, by contrast, are having a number of thoughts simultaneously. Bear wrestling was a standard feature of the travelling carnival circuit throughout the 1920s, operating under a straightforward commercial premise. Audience members paid a small fee, typically $1 or $2, for the opportunity to step into the ring with a trained bear and attempt to either pin the animal, stay on their feet for a designated time, or simply survive the experience with enough dignity to walk out without assistance. The carnival operator collected the entry fees and offered a modest cash prize to anyone who succeeded, a prize that was structured to be appealing enough to generate challenges and rare enough to maintain profitability. The bears were professionals. They had been trained from a young age by their handlers, who understood their animals with the intimacy of people whose physical safety depended on that understanding, and who had carefully developed routines that were theatrical, controlled, and safe in the specific direction that mattered, which was toward the bear. The bear's claws were typically blunted. Its behavior in the ring was shaped by training into patterns that gave challengers enough of an experience to feel they had genuinely contended with something, while keeping the interaction within parameters the handler could manage from the ring's edge. The bear was not trying to hurt anyone. It was, from its own perspective, engaged in a somewhat repetitive professional activity with an interminable series of amateur human collaborators. Alligator wrestling had a different character entirely, less cuddly in the European carnival tradition sense, and more specifically rooted in the American South, where the Seminole people of Florida had been demonstrating their skill and knowledge in handling alligators for generations before it became a commercial entertainment. By the 1920s, alligator wrestling shows were a fixture of Florida roadside attractions and traveling exhibitions, performed by Seminole men for tourist audiences, and by a growing number of showmen who had learned the techniques and added them to their entertainment repertoire. The core skill of alligator wrestling was the management of the animal's primary danger, its jaws, which could close with a force of more than 2,000 pounds per square inch, and which, once closed, could not be pulled open by human strength. The wrestler's technique involved controlling the alligator's head, keeping it pointed away, and exploiting the animal's relative passivity when rolled onto its back, a physiological quirk that produced a temporary immobility useful for theatrical purposes. The risk was real and the margin for error was narrow, and the men who did this well had an intimacy with the animals and their behaviour that made the act look either casual or miraculous, depending on your familiarity with what was actually being managed. Colonel steps toward you on his hind legs, and you do the thing the handler told you. You put your arms out, you make contact with the bear's forepaws, and suddenly you are locked in something that is technically wrestling, and is experientially like attempting to redirect a warm, heavy, extremely patient piece of furniture that has decided to lean on you. He smells like sawdust and something animal and indefinable. He is breathing. You are very aware that he is breathing. The crowd is laughing in the way people laugh when they are also slightly nervous. You push. The bear does not move. You push again. The bear blinks. This is, you realize, going to be a brief contest. The bear wins. The bear always wins. The bear has always won. You knew this going in. You paid $1 for it. You would, if pressed, probably do it again. Let's talk about crossword puzzles, which is the least dangerous thing on this list and still managed to cause a genuine national frenzy. The crossword puzzle was invented in 1913 and spent its first decade as a quiet novelty in the back pages of certain newspapers. Then, in 1924, the New York World published a book of crossword puzzles, the first such collection ever assembled, and American men who had apparently been waiting for a competitive intellectual hobby that could be done on a commuter train lost their minds entirely. Within months, crossword puzzle mania had swept the country with a speed and intensity that the decade reserved usually for stock tips and dance crazes. You're on a commuter train from New Jersey into Manhattan, and you have a crossword puzzle in your lap, and you have been on 17. A cross for what the clock above the door informs you has been 6 minutes, which is approximately 5 minutes and 50 seconds longer than 17 across should have taken. And you know this because the man sitting across from you finished the entire puzzle 8 minutes ago and has been sitting with it folded in his lap since then, and he keeps not looking at you in a way that communicates very clearly that he is aware of your situation and finds it interesting. The crossword puzzle arrived in America in December of 1913 in the Sunday supplement of the New York World, a diamond-shaped grid created by journalist Arthur Wynne, who called it a word cross and did not live to fully appreciate what he had set in motion. The puzzle appeared irregularly in that and other papers over the following decade, gradually accumulating a devoted readership without becoming the kind of cultural phenomenon it was about to become. Then, in April of 1924, the young publishing house of Simon & Schuster, in only its first year of operation, published the Crossword Puzzle Book, the first anthology of the form, accompanied by a small pencil attached to the cover, which was either thoughtful customer service or a very good marketing instinct. The book sold out immediately. A second printing sold out. A third. Simon & Schuster, which had printed the book somewhat tentatively and with modest expectations, found themselves at the centre of a genuine publishing phenomenon that they had not entirely anticipated and were very happy to receive. Within a year, virtually every major American newspaper had added a crossword puzzle to its pages. Books of puzzles became bestsellers. Competitive solving, timed, public with audiences, began appearing at clubs and social organizations. The crossword puzzle had gone from novelty to institution in approximately 14 months, which was fast even by the 1920s standards for adopting enthusiasms. The mania produced the full range of social responses that American cultural crazes always produced: enthusiastic adoption, competitive escalation, moral concern and commercial exploitation, often simultaneously. Crossword puzzle dictionaries appeared in bookstores to help solvers with obscure vocabulary. Specialized crossword puzzle notation systems were proposed and debated. Critics of the pastime appeared in newspapers, arguing that the puzzles were a waste of time, an addictive distraction, and a threat to genuine literacy. Arguments that were made with the same earnest alarm that would later accompany the arrival of television, video games, and social media, and that were similarly ineffective. What the crossword puzzle offered that made it so specifically appealing to the 1920s American male was a combination of individual competition and social currency. It was a thing you could do alone and then be demonstrably better or worse at than the man next to you. It required knowledge, specific, retrievable, displayable knowledge, which connected it to the era's celebration of self-improvement and personal cultivation. And it was portable and self-contained in a way that suited the rhythms of urban commuter life perfectly. You could do it on a train, in a lunchroom, in 10 minutes between other things. 17 across, 8 letters. Third letter is a T. The train is slowing for your stop. You look at the grid. You look out the window. You look back at the grid. The man across from you has his hat on and is preparing to stand. And then, there it is. The word assembles itself in your mind with the sudden completeness that good crossword answers always have. All at once, rather than letter by letter, the whole thing arriving, you write it in. The letters fit. You fold the paper with the unhurried composure of a man who was never particularly worried about 17 across, and you stand as the train reaches the platform. A very ordinary Tuesday morning triumph. You will think about it for the rest of the day. Let's talk about tightrope walking, which in the 1920s was still a genuine athletic and artistic discipline, with serious practitioners who spent years learning to do it, and which also attracted a significant population of amateurs who thought they could probably figure it out on their own with a rope and some optimism. High wire and tightrope acts had been a staple of American circus and carnival entertainment for decades, and the 1920s brought with them a new wave of performers who pushed the form further. Longer distances, greater heights, more elaborate stunts performed while balancing on a cable the width of a man's thumb. You are standing at one end of a wire strung between two platforms at a height of 60 feet, and the wire is 3/8 of an inch in diameter, and it extends before you for perhaps 40 meters across an open space above a circus ring, in which an audience is doing what audiences do in this situation, looking up with the specific expression of people who are very glad they are not you, while also being unable to look away. In your hands is a long balance pole, perhaps 30 pounds of aluminum and steel that you hold with a relaxed, careful grip. The wire under your feet has a particular quality of feel that you have spent years learning. The give of it, the oscillation frequency, the way it communicates information about your balance through the soles of your feet in a language that is entirely physical and cannot be translated into words. The high wire had been a circus staple since before the Civil War, and the lineage of great wire walkers stretched back through the 19th century to figures like Charles Blondin, the French-Canadian performer who had famously crossed Niagara Falls on a tightrope in 1859, an act so far beyond anything that had preceded it that it established the high wire as a vehicle for genuine spectacle rather than mere skill demonstration. By the 1920s, the tradition Blondin had established was being maintained and extended by a community of performers scattered across the American and European circus circuits, each developing their own signature style, their own signature stunts, and their own competitive relationship with height and distance. The distinction between tightrope and high wire was technical but meaningful to practitioners. Tightrope, strictly speaking, referred to a rope or cable under high tension, essentially rigid, with minimal deflection under the walker's weight. High wire referred to a cable under somewhat less tension, which introduced a dynamic element. The wire had flex and bounce that had to be managed rather than simply tolerated. Slack wire, the most forgiving and the most acrobatic form, was the province of performers who used the wire's movement as an element of their act, rather than something to be minimized. Each discipline had its own technique, its own community of practitioners, and its own scale of achievement. The balance pole was the distinguishing tool of the high-wire walker, and was itself a subject of considerable craft and opinion. A heavier pole lowered the walker's centre of gravity, increasing stability but increasing fatigue over a long crossing. A lighter pole allowed more active balance adjustments, but was less forgiving of errors. The length and weight distribution of the pole were matters each performer calibrated to their own body and their own technique, and experienced wire walkers were as opinionated about their poles as woodworkers are about their chisels. Amateur wire walking was a genuine presence in the 1920s physical culture landscape. YMCA gymnasiums and athletic clubs sometimes maintained low-practice wires, and the activity attracted men who were drawn to the specific challenge of a skill that was entirely about internal precision, about the calibration of the body's own balance system. There was no strength component, no speed component. A wire walker was not competing against anyone or anything except the wire and gravity, and the discipline was to eliminate from the body every motion that was not purposeful, and to make every purposeful motion exactly the right size. 1 step. 2. The wire transmits information through your feet in the continuous low-level conversation that constitutes walking a wire at 60 feet. Adjustments so small and so constant that they barely register as adjustments, only as the ongoing fact of balance. The pole moves in your hands with a responsiveness that feels, after years of practice, like an extension of your arms rather than a separate object. Below you the audience is very quiet, which is what audiences do when they have decided to be respectful of something. 20 meters to the platform. 10. Let's talk about the home production of alcohol, which in the 1920s became a hobby, an industry, a science experiment, and occasionally a medical emergency, all at the same time. Prohibition, the nationwide ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages that went into effect in January of 1920, did not make Americans stop drinking. It made them extremely creative about where the drinking came from. Across the country, in kitchens and basements and garages and barns, men took it upon themselves to produce their own supply of beer, wine, and spirits, with varying degrees of success, an impressive range of improvised equipment, and the specific confidence of someone who has read one article about fermentation and believes himself to be adequately prepared. You're standing in your basement in front of an apparatus that you have assembled over the course of 3 weekends and that your wife has asked you about twice, both times accepting your answer of a project with a patience that suggests she knows exactly what kind of project it is and has decided to maintain a formal position of not knowing. The apparatus involves a large ceramic crock, several feet of copper tubing acquired from a plumbing supply shop where you were asked no questions, a gas burner, 2 large glass jars, and a thermometer. You have a notebook. You have been taking notes. You are, by your own assessment, approaching this scientifically. The 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors, contained a provision that allowed the production of fermented fruit juices for personal use, a clause intended to protect home winemakers that was interpreted by an enormous number of Americans with a breadth of creative generosity that the amendment's authors had probably not anticipated. Grape juice concentrate sold in grocery stores during Prohibition came with labels warning the buyer that the product should not be dissolved in water and left in a cool place for 21 days, as this would cause it to ferment into wine, warnings that functioned for a significant portion of the purchasing public as instructions. Beer brewing was the most widely practiced form of home alcohol production, accessible in terms of equipment, relatively forgiving in terms of technique, and capable of producing a recognizable product even under amateur conditions. The basic equipment, a large vessel for fermentation, some form of container for conditioning, and bottles, was affordable and available. Malt extract could be purchased legally, hops were available at many pharmacies. The knowledge required circulated freely through communities in the form of passed-down recipes, neighbour-to-neighbour advice, and the kind of informal technical consultation that took place over back fences and in hardware stores without anyone using language that would require a federal response. Spirits were a more technically demanding proposition. The distillation process, heating a fermented liquid to vaporize the alcohol and then condensing the vapor back into liquid form, required equipment that was harder to assemble and a level of process control that separated the practitioners who produced something drinkable from those who produced something that was technically alcohol but also contained methanol and other congeners that caused anything from a severe headache to permanent blindness. The quality variation in home-distilled spirits during Prohibition ranged from genuinely fine products made by careful and knowledgeable practitioners to genuinely dangerous ones made by people who had skipped the parts of the process where the details mattered. The term bathtub gin described a category of spirit made by combining industrial or medicinal alcohol, which remained legal in various forms throughout Prohibition, with water, glycerin for smoothness, and juniper oil or other botanicals for flavour. The bathtub referred not to the vessel of production, but to the fact that the bottles used were often too tall to be filled under a standard tap, and had to be filled in a bathtub. The quality of the result depended entirely on the quality of the starting alcohol and the balance of the flavouring, and the range of outcomes was wide. The thermometer reads correctly. The copper coil is doing what copper coils do. The first jar is filling with something that is, by the evidence of smell and appearance, what you are hoping to produce. You record the temperature in your notebook. You adjust the burner slightly. You are a man in a basement in 1923 conducting an experiment in applied chemistry, and the experiment is going well, and somewhere upstairs your wife is reading a magazine and maintaining a formal position of not knowing, and outside on the street the world is entirely prohibited, and down here everything's proceeding exactly according to plan. And so here you are, still breathing, still horizontal we hope, tucked in, lights low, the fan doing its quiet work somewhere nearby. You have just spent the better part of an evening travelling through the 1920s in a company of men who looked at the world and its perfectly adequate collection of reasonable activities and said, "No, I think I'll sit on a pole instead. I think I'll get in the cannon. I think I'll wrestle the bear, ride the wall, walk the wire, get in the water, stay on the horse, keep dancing, keep pedalling, keep rocking, keep going, until someone tells me to stop, or my body files the appropriate paperwork." It would be easy to laugh at them, and we have a little, because some of what they did was genuinely and objectively absurd. Flagpole sitting, rocking chair contests, a man in a barrel going sideways on a motorcycle next to a lion. These are not the activities of a people who had fully thought things through. But here is the other thing, the thing worth holding on to as you drift towards sleep tonight. They were alive in it. Completely, uncomplicatedly, embarrassingly alive. They lived in a decade that was loud and fast and excessive in almost every direction, and they met it at full speed, and they found their thrills wherever the thrills were available, whether that was 60 feet in the air on a wire or 80 feet above a pool on a platform, or shuffling across a dance floor on hour 49 with someone else's soup on a spoon headed toward their face. They did not do these things because they were required to. They did them because something in them needed to be tested, needed to be pushed, needed to find out, quietly or loudly, publicly, or in a basement with a thermometer and a notebook what they were made of, and most of them found out. Most of them climbed back down or landed in the net or got off the bicycle or got out of the cold water or folded their crossword puzzle and put it in their pocket with the satisfaction of 17 across finally solved. They went home, they ate dinner, they told the story, and then, eventually, some Tuesday or some Thursday, they looked around at the perfectly adequate world and felt the particular itch again and started making a new plan. So tonight, as you sink a little deeper into your pillow, your warm, dry, entirely earthbound pillow, at a height of approximately 2 feet above the ground, which is a deeply reasonable height, maybe spare a quiet thought for the men of the 1920s, the ones who climbed things, the ones who jumped, the ones who got back on after they fell off, put the leather helmet back on, chalked the cue, rewrapped the feet, refilled the jar, and went again. They were ridiculous. They were stubborn. They were, in their loud and slightly unhinged way, magnificent. Sleep well. You've earned it. You stayed in your bed all evening, which, honestly, given some of the alternatives we discussed tonight, was the smartest thing anyone did in this entire script.